Let's talk about transforming again. So in a previous video, we transformed our shapes or layers using the Move tool. However, I don't find this way of doing it so great. Sometimes it's useful, but I find for the most part it can be pretty intrusive. So let me get set up by creating a shape on the canvas, and then I will switch to the Move tool. Once I switch to the Move tool, you see this bounding box appear. This is because in the options on top, I have Show Transform Controls enabled. So in some situations, this could be useful, fast, and intuitive. However, for the most part, I personally don't like seeing this bounding box. I find it gets in the way visually, but also you might accidentally click on one of these handles and enable the transform. You see, so I just clicked on the handle. I'm now in transform mode. Other features of the interface are locked out, and I must finish the transform. So instead, what I recommend is that we turn off Show Transform Controls. So I would like everybody to turn off the option for Show Transform Controls. That way we don't see them, it doesn't clutter up our interface. And the way I want you to transform is using the free transform tool. So to find it, you go up into the edit menu and choose free transform. So you might think this is a longer process, but it is definitely worth it to avoid seeing that transform box all over your canvas. And you might notice the keyboard shortcut for it, Command T. All keyboard shortcuts for items in the menu will have a modifier key, and then T for transform. So it's an easy one to remember, Command T for transform, and you'll probably become familiar with it if you choose to work this way inside Photoshop. So just a quick refresher on how this transform tool works. So you have the edges, which are all activated to scale the object. So you can click anywhere on an edge to scale in that direction. And you'll notice that Photoshop is locking the aspect ratio. So that is because this option right here on top, the chain, is enabled. So this links the aspect ratio of the width and the height so that when you scale, you're always keeping a consistent shape. So if you want to disable this, there are two ways. You can click on the chain to turn it off. Now when you scale in a certain direction, you will distort the object. The other way that people tend to work is we leave this on. So I'm going to turn the chain back on to link the proportions. And instead we use the modifier key Shift. So if I'm scaling from the corner without holding Shift, the proportions are locked. But if I hold down the Shift button, you'll see it temporarily deactivates the chain. And now I could squish the object in any way. Okay, so be careful of this. When you're working with shapes, it might not be a big deal, but when you're working with photos, distorting the proportions will instantly ruin the photo. So never, never, never do that when you're working with photos unless you have a really good reason. So that's scaling. We also have rotating. So if you move your mouse just outside the edge of the bounding box, you'll see the icon change into little curvy arrows. That's indicating that you will rotate. Then you could click and drag to rotate, and you'll notice Photoshop is telling you the exact amount that you're rotating. Now, if you want to be precise with this, it can be quite difficult manually. So you might want to learn the Shift keyboard shortcut or modifier key to lock the angle of increment. So if I hold the Shift button, now when I rotate, I'm locked to 15-degree increments. Okay, so we've seen this before, and just a little refresher on using the Shift button to ensure that you rotate and snap to 15-degree increments precisely. It's very good for rotating by 90 degrees, 45 degrees, and keeping things nice. So when you're done the transform, you'll want to push the Enter button on the keyboard, or you can use the check mark over here at the top. Or if you ruin things and you want to get out of this without applying the transform, you can press the Escape button on your keyboard or press this button over here. And that will cancel the transform. There is another keyboard modifier that I want to show you. So I'm going to enable free transform again, and it is the Alt button or the Option button. Okay, so if you scale while holding the Alt button, what you'll do is scale from the center. So you'll notice with the Alt button pressed and held, it is starting to scale from the center of the object. So this could be useful to keep an object in its position and scale equally outwards or inwards from the center. So without the Alt button, you'll see you scale in one direction and it is locked from the opposite edge. However, with the Alt button, it is locked from the center and scales outwards or inwards from all the edges. Another thing about scaling and rotating, so one more thing about transforming and rotating and scaling is the transform origin. So it seems like in the newer versions of Photoshop, the transform origin is hidden, but you can still access it using this option up here with the checkbox. So click over here to turn it on, and you will see that you now have access to the transform origin marker. So it's easiest to see with rotation. So if I were to rotate, you see it's rotating around that transform origin. But you can take this transform origin, so avoid clicking on this unless you know what you're doing, because clicking on this will move the transform origin. So let me click and drag it and move it to the bottom left corner, and now you'll see what happens when I rotate. It is now locked, as if there's a thumbtack going through the object, locking into the canvas from that point, and then your transform will be in relation to that. So that's pretty useful. I think you could click on this over here to automatically change it. So if you want the top left corner of the object, you can click up here to change it. And it's a quick way to move the transform origin around or to get it back in the center. So I'm just going to go ahead and cancel that. There are other transforms that you can do. Scaling and rotating are not the only ones, and there are a couple ways to access them. So you might have noticed when I went to the Edit menu, just below the free transform, there's a group here called Transform. And inside here, you will see other kinds of transforms that you could do. Rotate, skew, distort, and perspective. So they're fun. I'm not going to show them all. You can have fun playing around with them, but I'll show the skew. And now the mouse is indicating that you can do different things. So instead of scaling from the edge, you're now skewing from the edge. Okay. And a quicker way to access this is actually you can right click. So you don't always need to come back up here into the menu to find these different options for transforming. So distorting is pretty cool. You can completely distort the shape. And the other way to access these transforms is by right clicking. So while you are in a free transform or in any other transform, you can right click and it brings up the menu for the other options. You can also very easily flip a shape, flip horizontal, or flip vertical. And you see some other useful things here for rotating by set amounts. So that's it for transforming. That's most of what you can do inside Photoshop. Keep in mind Photoshop is a pixel-based tool, so it is not the master of vectors and shapes and these kinds of things that I've been doing, but it is still pretty good, and you can see there are lots of options. And I might want to mention one last thing actually, and that's the options at the top up here. So you can also transform by value using some of these options over here. So let me go back into scale. Okay, so you can change the X position. You can click and drag on the X marker to move it around manually, or you can type in a value. So if I know I want it at the 0 point, I'll just press 0, or halfway in the canvas, you can type in a value, and that's Y for the up and down, right? So Photoshop actually works from the top left. So 0, 0 will be the top left of the canvas, and as you increase, you'll move further to the right and further down. You can also change the width and height here, scale by percentage. So if you know you want it exactly twice as big, you can type in 200%. And you see because the chain is linked, then we have the height scaling at the equal proportion. You can rotate by value. So if you know you want to rotate it exactly 23.25 degrees, you can do that. And then these are other values, I believe, for skewing. Yeah, skewing, horizontal and vertical. And then there's some other things. You got some funky transforms over here. I'm not a big fan. There are sometimes they are useful, but in general I don't use them too much. People tend to use it with text a lot, and I strongly advise you to avoid that unless it's um, really relevant for what you're trying to do. All right, so that's it for transforming.